The fluorescent lights hummed their constant mechanical song above the ER supply closet at Mercy General, a sound Margaret Walsh had learned to filter out the same way she filtered out everything else, efficiently, without acknowledgement. It was 5:11 a.m. on a Tuesday, 13 minutes before the first shift nurse would arrive, and she was exactly where she always was, checking inventory on the crash cart with the methodical precision of someone who understood that a missing 14-gauge angiocath needle could cost someone their life. Her hands moved through the supplies with muscle memory that ran deeper than nursing school. Defibrillator pads. Check. Epinephrine in the locked drawer. Check. Intubation equipment sorted by size. She didn't count out loud anymore. That was a habit from another life, another uniform, one that didn't exist in any official record anymore. 12 years of that life, 3 major deployments, 2 continents where her name had meant something specific. Now she was just Margaret, the quiet nurse who always volunteered for the graveyard shift, the one nobody looked at twice. The supply closet smelled like antiseptic and plastic packaging, that particular hospital smell that never quite washed out of scrub fabric. Margaret straightened the last row of sterile gauze and closed the cabinet door with a soft click. 6 months at Mercy General. 6 months of keeping her head down, wearing the invisibility like armor, answering to doctors who didn't ask her name and patients who called her honey or sometimes dear. It was better this way. Safer. The military had been clear about that when they erased her records and told her to disappear into civilian life. No contact with former command. No mention of previous service. Become someone else and stay that way. She stepped out of the supply closet into the pre-dawn quiet of the emergency department. The ER at Mercy General was like any other: beige walls, too many fluorescent panels, the ghost smell of 100 different traumas soaked into the tile floor. In 3 hours it would be chaos. In 3 hours, people would arrive broken and bleeding and terrified, and Margaret would move through that chaos the way she'd moved through worse places. With absolute calm. With precision. The other nurses had started to notice. They whispered sometimes when they thought she wasn't listening. How does she never get rattled? Did you see her start and fall on that septic patient? Her hands were steady as a laser. She didn't tell them where steady hands came from. Margaret's locker was in the break room, a narrow grey rectangle among 30 identical narrow grey rectangles. She opened hers and checked her phone. A text from her son, Marcus, sent at 10:34 p.m. the night before: "Mom working late again." She texted back quickly. "Always. How's the homework?" His reply came almost instantly, which meant he was already awake, probably getting ready for his own 6 a.m. rowing practice before school. "Done. Why do you work as a nurse anyway? You're like the smartest person I know. Why not do something bigger?" Margaret stared at the screen for a long moment. He had no idea what bigger looked like. He had no idea that his mother had once commanded 47 people across 3 continents, that she'd made decisions that shaped the course of classified operations, that she'd earned a Navy Cross for an extraction that saved 17 American lives in a place that officially didn't matter. She had no idea his commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Brooks, the man Marcus had mentioned last month when he was excited about a new training rotation, was recovering from surgery in this very building, and that Margaret had been keeping one eye on his chart all week because she'd promised her son she'd watch out for him. "Love you," she typed. Some things don't have to be big to matter. She pocketed her phone and sat on the hard plastic chair in the break room, pulling the worn combat boots from the bottom of her locker. They were the only piece of her old life she'd allowed herself to keep. Still caked with the dust of Marjah, still creased from the way she'd worn them for 18 months of operations, still bearing the scuff marks from rotor wash and rock and the kind of terrain that tested equipment and people to their absolute limits. No one here knew what those boots meant. No one here knew that the careful knot she tied each morning was a habit from a different woman in a different uniform, the one who'd learned that a loose lace could trip you at the moment it mattered most. She changed into her scrubs in the locker room, the top fitting loose over shoulders that had more definition than a year of civilian life could erase, the pants tucked smooth and neat. Her badge clipped to the collar with the practice snap of someone who'd dressed for combat operations so many times that dressing for a hospital shift felt like moving in slow motion. The other night shift nurses would be arriving soon. She could hear the parking lot filling up, car doors closing, the sound of tired people moving toward another night of healing the broken and holding the dying. The ER was still quiet when Margaret stepped back into it. Only the monitor in Bay 4 was beeping, a regular, healthy rhythm from the overnight observation patient, someone recovering from a routine appendectomy. In a moment, the organized chaos would begin. Ambulances would arrive. The intercom would crackle. The fluorescent lights would suddenly feel like they were burning directly into her skull the way they always did when the shift picked up. She'd move through it all with the same invisible competence she'd been moving through it with since she arrived 6 months ago, and nobody would understand why a nurse who could start an 4 in the dark, who could talk a suicidal teenager back from a ledge, who could keep a trauma patient alive long enough for surgery with nothing but knowledge and calm, nobody would understand why she was still just a nurse. The thing was, she'd tried to explain it to Marcus once. She'd told him that sometimes the biggest things you could do in the world happened in small rooms, in moments no one would ever know about, in the quiet decision to show up and do the work that mattered. She'd told him that power wasn't about titles or uniforms, that heroism was what you did when the world stopped watching. He'd nodded like he understood, but she could see in his face that he thought his mother was somehow wasting her potential. He had no context for what she'd already survived. He had no framework for understanding that she wasn't hiding in this job, she was healing in it. She was becoming human again. That was when the elevator doors opened and Dr. Sterling stepped into the ER like he owned it. Margaret noticed him the way she noticed everything, the expensive shoes that clicked too loud on the tile, the cologne that was too strong for a hospital environment, the way his eyes swept across the empty trauma bays with a kind of predatory satisfaction. Sterling had the kind of presence that made the air pressure change, the kind of appearance that turned his own reflection into a status symbol. Dark hair styled with the precision of someone who thought grooming was part of dominance. A jawline that could cut glass, or so the female residents had whispered in the break room last week, though Margaret had barely glanced at him when he'd passed. She had an internal filter for that kind of assessment. Beautiful or ugly, confident or insecure, none of it changed what needed to be done. Sterling's eyes found her by the supply station and moved right past her, the way eyes always did. She was checking the defibrillator battery, her movements economical and precise, her face the neutral expression of someone performing a necessary task. He didn't see the way she'd already mapped the exits in this room, the locations of all the emergency equipment, the optimal positions for movement if something went sideways. He didn't see the small scar tissue on her right forearm where shrapnel had caught her in Sanjin Valley, the way her shoulders had the kind of definition that came from years of tactical training, not from a boutique gym membership. He didn't see her at all, really. He saw a quiet nurse in standard-issue scrubs, someone who kept her head down, someone unremarkable. And that was exactly how Margaret preferred it. "You're the new one," Sterling said, approaching without being addressed, the way doctors did. "Walsh, right?" "Yes, doctor," Margaret said without looking up from the defibrillator pads. Her voice was soft, deferential. Every word of it was a lie she'd become very good at telling. "You volunteering for all these late shifts, or is there a problem with day shift?" He asked it like it was a question, but his tone made clear he'd already formed his judgment. "No problem. I prefer the nights," Margaret said. "Fewer interruptions for the work." Sterling smiled. It was the kind of smile that showed teeth without reaching his eyes. "Ambitious. I like it. Or maybe just avoiding the harder patients." He started to walk past her toward the physician's lounge, then turned back. "By the way, the post-op in room for 47 is yours tonight. Don't let the chart overwhelm you. Some nurses find the complexity frustrating." Margaret glanced up just long enough to meet his eyes. "I'll manage, doctor." But that wasn't what she was thinking. She was thinking about the chart she'd reviewed an hour ago, about the post-operative patient recovering from cardiac surgery under Sterling's management. She was thinking about the subtle signs of cardiac tamponade that shouldn't have been present, the way the fluid buildup was being monitored instead of managed, the clinical negligence that was hiding behind expensive education and inherited confidence. She was thinking about the name on that chart, Lieutenant Commander Brooks, her son's commanding officer. The thing about having spent 18 months conducting search and rescue operations in classified locations was that you learned to read situations with absolute clarity. You learned to assess threats and resources and timelines with the kind of precision that separated successful missions from disasters. You learned that sometimes doing nothing was the worst possible choice. Margaret set down the defibrillator and walked toward the medical record station, her mind already 3 steps ahead of her feet, already calculating what that chart was going to tell her about Dr. Sterling's competence and Lieutenant Commander Brooks's danger. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. The monitors beat their steady rhythms. And in the pre-dawn quiet of the emergency department at Mercy General, the invisible nurse began to pay very close attention to a patient who had no idea that his survival might depend on a woman who wasn't supposed to exist. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Sterling had no idea who he was standing next to. During morning surgical rounds, Dr. Sterling paused at the head of the conference table, his tailored jacket catching the overhead lights, and announced to the entire assembled team that he would personally bet $200 Margaret Walsh quit within 7 days. Some people, he said with theatrical slowness, simply weren't cut out for real medicine. The residents shifted their weight. One stared at her shoes. Margaret stood at the back of the group, near the whiteboard with its list of post-op patients, and took one measured breath through her nose. A single tear escaped her left eye. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Sterling, her face perfectly still, and said nothing at all. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then Sterling laughed, a sharp, barking sound that echoed off the tile, and moved on to discuss the day's surgical schedule as if he'd just made a joke about the weather. The next morning in the cafeteria, Margaret was carrying a tray with a salad and black coffee when Dr. Sterling rounded the corner from the beverage station. He didn't slow down. His shoulder connected with her tray at precisely the right angle, not accidental, not quite, and her lunch scattered across the floor like shrapnel. A container of dressing burst open. The salad leaves skidded across the tile in 3 different directions. 2 other doctors pretended not to see. Sterling stepped over the mess without pausing, then turned back with a smirk that suggested he'd just remembered something amusing. He reached down, grabbed a patient chart from the nearest table, and tossed it underhand so it landed directly at Margaret's feet. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice carrying across the cafeteria with the kind of volume that ensures an audience. "She'll make a good housekeeping candidate if the nursing thing doesn't work out." Margaret knelt slowly, her movements precise and deliberate, and retrieved the chart from the floor. The tile was cold against her kneecaps. She could feel every pair of eyes in the cafeteria on her back, the uncomfortable weight of attention mixed with something worse, pity. She stood to her full height, her posture absolutely straight, and held the chart at her side. Then she looked directly at Dr. Sterling with eyes that had watched men bleed out in the dust of Marjah and said in a voice like still water, "I've picked up heavier things than your ego, doctor." The cafeteria went completely silent. Sterling's face flushed crimson. His jaw tightened. For exactly 2 seconds he seemed to consider something, his hands curling into fists, before he forced a laugh and turned away, muttering something to his colleague about respect and insubordination. But Margaret heard the tremor underneath the bluster, the sound of a man suddenly uncertain whether he'd been clever or stupid. She set the chart down on the nearest table, picked up the scattered remains of her lunch with a paper towel, and threw it away. Then she refilled her coffee and walked back to the surgical ward as if nothing had happened. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It changed the equation. Over the next 2 days, Sterling's attacks intensified like someone testing the boundaries of a dam. During a procedure on Thursday afternoon, while a patient's family watched from the observation window, he called her Maggie the Timid in front of everyone and told her to remove her anxiety from his operating theater. Later that same day, he deliberately knocked over a specimen tray, a cascade of tubes and slides across the floor, and ordered her to clean it up, his tone suggesting she'd been the one responsible. Margaret retrieved the supplies with the same unhurried precision she'd used to pack equipment before helicopter insertions in Kandahar. She said nothing. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing stayed steady. The other nurses watched in something like horror, expecting her to cry or argue or show some sign of the pressure they could all feel building in the room like barometric pressure before a storm. But Margaret Walsh had learned long ago that the most dangerous thing you could do was show your opponent your breaking point. So she didn't break. She simply worked. The post-operative ward buzzed with the sound of ventilators and cardiac monitors. Room for 47 held Lieutenant Commander Brooks, her own son's commanding officer, recovering from emergency cardiac surgery. She'd promised her boy, over the phone, his voice tight with something between pride and worry, that she'd keep an eye on Brooks during his recovery. The man was only 42, already a legend in the Special Warfare Command with 2 Bronze Stars and a Silver Star earning space in his service record. He should have been recovering smoothly. Instead, Sterling kept dismissing her observations about Brooks's vital signs. She noted the irregular heartbeat on day 2. Sterling said it was normal post-operative irritability. She flagged the fluid retention in his legs on day 3. Sterling ordered diuretics without checking the echocardiogram. She documented the decreased oxygen saturation on the night shift. Sterling suggested she was being overly anxious about a routine case. But pain is data, and Margaret had spent 15 years reading the language of wounded bodies in impossible places. On Tuesday morning at 7:48 a.m., Margaret was checking Brooks's central line when his monitor alarm spiked like a scream. His blood pressure dropped from 118 to 94 in the space of 30 seconds. His breathing became labored, his chest visibly distended, his face darkening toward that particular shade of blue that meant his heart couldn't deliver oxygen to his brain anymore. She recognized it instantly, the same presentation she'd seen in a Humvee outside Sanjin Valley when a 20-year-old Lance Corporal took shrapnel through the chest. Cardiac tamponade. Blood filling the space around his heart, compressing it, suffocating it from the outside. She paged Sterling's stat and began prepping. Brooks gasped that he couldn't breathe, his eyes locking on hers with the particular terror of a trained warrior suddenly stripped of agency. She watched his neck veins bulge, visibly distended, the body's desperate attempt to fight the pressure building inside his chest. The monitor showed his heart rate climbing past 140. His oxygen saturation dropped to 88 and kept falling. She calculated the seconds he had left, 3 minutes, maybe 4, before his heart rate became too chaotic to sustain consciousness. Then the collapse. Then the codes that probably wouldn't work because the problem wasn't his heart. It was the blood pressing down on it. Sterling arrived, froze at the bedside, and started ordering unnecessary tests. Stat EKG. Chest X-ray. Cardiology consultation. Margaret's voice remained absolutely level. We have minutes, not hours. He needs immediate pericardiocentesis. Needle decompression of the pericardial space. Sterling snapped that she was a nurse, not a diagnostician, and ordered her to wait for cardiology to evaluate. His words came out sharp, clipped, undercut with the particular anger of a man who didn't like being corrected in front of other staff. The tone was meant to humiliate. Margaret had learned to recognize humiliation the way a bomb tech recognizes the sound of a trigger mechanism clicking into place, a warning, nothing more. She watched Brooks's lips turn from pink to blue. She watched his oxygen saturation tick down, 85. 82, 79. She listened to his breathing become a series of short, terrified gasps. And she made her choice. Then the overhead speakers crackled with a code gray announcement. A violent intruder had entered through the main emergency entrance. A man, described as approximately 6'5", enraged, shouting incoherently about medications and corporate conspiracy. He was overturning chairs in the waiting room. Security was responding, but backup was still 12 minutes away. Staff should secure all locked access points immediately. The announcement repeated twice, and after the second repetition the ER transformed like a school of fish scattering from a shark. Doctors sprinted toward the administrative wing. Nurses pulled patients into rooms and locked the doors behind them. A tech wheeled an elderly woman back toward the ICU. The waiting room had dissolved into chaos. Margaret could hear it from where she stood, the sound of furniture scraping against tile, a man's voice rising like an air raid siren, the particular panic frequency that happens when civilians encounter true violence. Someone was screaming. Someone else was praying. Dr. Sterling abandoned Brooks's room entirely, moving with remarkable speed toward the administrative corridor. His face had gone pale. His hand shook slightly. He didn't even glance back at his patient. Margaret stood completely still. Brooks gasped something that might have been her name. The monitor screamed. His oxygen saturation flashed red, 76. 72, 68. She had maybe 90 seconds before the collapse became irreversible. She could run. She could lock a door and wait for security to handle the intruder, for cardiology to arrive, for the system to work the way systems are supposed to work when everything goes perfectly according to protocol. She could be safe. Instead, she leaned down and told Brooks to keep breathing, that she was going to fix this, and then she walked directly toward the commotion. The footsteps grew louder as she moved toward the main ER entrance. Not running. Walking. Her pace was even, her breathing controlled, her mind operating at the kind of crystalline clarity that comes from having already survived the worst thing that could possibly happen. The man's voice became clearer, incoherent but furious, the particular rage of someone who believed they'd been wronged by an uncaring system and had decided to make that system feel his pain instead. She could hear him overturning furniture with systematic destruction, the sound of a metal chair hitting tile, the wet crunch of something breaking. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. She turned the corner into the main ER waiting room and saw him, a man taller than her by nearly a foot, wide-shouldered, with the kind of physical presence that made the air pressure change. His eyes were wild, his fists clenched, his breathing ragged with the kind of rage that burns out rational thought. He was holding a fire extinguisher in one hand like it weighed nothing. The waiting room looked like a minor disaster, chairs overturned, a table on its side, magazines scattered like snow. 2 security officers stood 30 feet away, clearly trying to figure out how to approach without escalating further. When the man saw Margaret emerge from the corridor, he turned the fire extinguisher toward her. But Margaret Walsh had walked toward worse with nothing but a medical bag and the knowledge that someone's son was waiting for her to come home. She didn't flinch. She didn't freeze. She simply stopped walking, planted her feet exactly 6 feet away from him, and met his wild eyes with the kind of calm that comes from having already died once and decided that wasn't going to be the end of the story. "Sir," she said in that same voice like still water. "I need you to put that down. I'm going to need both your hands in just a moment." The man stared at her. The security officers froze, clearly unsure whether she was insane or had suddenly become the most dangerous person in the room. And Margaret Walsh stood absolutely still, waiting for him to make his choice. The monitors started singing different songs on Tuesday morning. Margaret had made the first rounds at 6, checking vitals, noting Sterling's discharge orders for room for 47 were already written out even though Brooks's lung sounds hadn't cleared, even though the chest x-ray from yesterday showed something brewing beneath the surface. She'd flagged it in the chart. Sterling had signed it anyway. That was the way of things at Mercy General. The attending's signature weighed more than a nurse's read of the room, especially a nurse who'd kept her head down for 6 months, who asked no questions and made no waves. By 9:30, Brooks's breathing had shifted. Not dramatically. Just a fractional change in the pattern, a slight increase in respiratory rate. His hands were restless against the sheets, fingers picking at nothing. His eyes moved without focus. Margaret stood at the bedside, watching him the way she'd once watched patrol routes in Helmand Province, not with anxiety, but with the particular attention that comes from knowing something wasn't right yet but would be soon. She placed her palm on his chest. Felt the breath moving too fast. Felt something else underneath, a subtle distension she could almost see now that she was looking for it. Not obvious. Not the kind of thing an attending who'd already written discharge papers would notice on a quick room check. But it was there. Blood pooling in the pericardial sac, the membrane around the heart, compressing it like a fist slowly closing. Cardiac tamponade. That's what Sterling had missed. She reached for his blood pressure cuff. 115/72 at 6 a.m. 9:30 now. 108/64. The numbers were walking downward like a countdown clock nobody else had noticed starting. The first alarm came at 9:42. Not a gentle alert. A sharp, demanding scream from the monitor mounted on the wall. The kind of alarm that made the unit clerk's head snap up and made visitors in other rooms tense against their pillows. Margaret was already moving, already reaching for the call light, already assessing Brooks's color, which had shifted from baseline to a grayish pallor that meant his body was shutting blood away from his skin to keep it where the major organs could still reach it. His breathing came in short, desperate pulls now. Chest heaving. Neck veins distended like cables. His lips taking on that bluish tint that spoke of oxygen molecules wandering lost through his bloodstream, unable to reach the cells that needed them. Blood pressure 89/43. The monitors weren't just alarming anymore. They were wailing, a cacophony of escalating warnings from machines that had been watching his physiology collapse in real time. The oxygen saturation was dropping. 92. 88. 84. Each number a step closer to something her brain was already naming, cardiac arrest. "Get me the doctor," Margaret said, her voice steady as she moved to Brooks's bedside, already pulling the supplies she'd need. "Now." The resident came first, a nervous kid named Chen who looked at the monitors and looked at Brooks and looked back at the monitors as though they might have made a mistake. "What's happening?" Chen asked, but he was asking the machines, not Margaret, asking them to explain why a patient who'd been stable 6 hours ago was suddenly dying on his watch. "Contact Dr. Sterling. Tell him it's emergent." Margaret was already pulling sterile gloves from the box with a sound like a snap, crisp and definitive. Her movements had shifted. They were no longer the careful, deferential movements of a floor nurse. They were the movements of someone with a decision tree already mapped in her mind, someone who'd been in rooms where every second was blood and consequence. Sterling arrived 4 minutes later, but those 4 minutes were geological. The room had filled with more staff, more alarms, more of the controlled chaos that hospitals use to pretend they're not slowly losing someone. Brooks's blood pressure had bottomed out at 71/38. His breathing was becoming irregular, long moments of nothing, then gasping pulls that meant his brainstem was triggering survival responses his conscious mind couldn't control. Sterling walked in and stopped. Margaret knew that look. She'd seen it on younger soldiers during their first contact, that moment when the training they'd memorized stopped matching the reality in front of them. His face had gone slack. His eyes moved across the monitors, across Brooks's distended chest and the color draining from the man's face, and then his eyes stopped moving at all. "Cardiac tamponade," Margaret said, not asking, not suggesting. "Pericardiocentesis. Now." Sterling didn't move. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again like a fish pulled from water, operating on reflex without any intention behind it. "Doctor." Margaret's voice had changed. It had become the kind of voice that carries authority the way some voices carry warmth. It came from deeper, from a place where uncertainty had long ago been surgically removed. The needle. The tray. "Step back." She was already reaching for the equipment, already moving, and nobody in the room, not the resident, not the nurses, not even Sterling, was processing the fact that she was the one doing this. They were all watching the monitors. They were all holding their breath in that way hospital people do when someone's vital signs are writing a murder mystery on a screen in real time. The needle was 18 gauge, long enough to reach through the chest wall and through the layers of muscle and fat and fascia to where the pericardium lived, the membrane that was now holding Brooks's life hostage. She'd learned this procedure 15 years ago during trauma certification training, had performed it twice in the field, intense without electricity, with dust from blown-apart villages settling on sterile fields because there was no such thing as sterile when the alternative was watching someone die from complications you could fix. She positioned Brooks, angling his body, finding the xiphoid process and counting ribs the way she'd counted 1,000 other anatomical landmarks in 1,000 other emergency moments. 4-5 intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Her hands moving with the kind of precision that comes from muscle memory, from cells remembering what the conscious mind had learned long ago. The needle went in. For a moment, the space between breaths, nothing. Then the hiss of pressurized air escaping, a sound like the world letting out a breath it had been holding. Clear fluid, slightly tinged with blood, came through the syringe. 30 cc 40. 50. The pressure that had been strangling Brooks's heart was releasing in increments, each withdrawal of fluid like releasing a tourniquet from an artery. The monitors began to sing again, different notes this time, better notes. The oxygen saturation climbed. 88. 92. 96. The blood pressure started to find its way back up. 74. 81. 90. The frantic gasping of his breathing started to organize itself into something closer to rhythm. 120 cc of blood. That was what had been killing him, 120 milliliters of his own insides, pooling in the space around his heart because Sterling had missed the diagnosis, had written discharge papers instead of ordering an ultrasound, had walked away from a patient who was slowly drowning from the inside. Margaret withdrew the needle and placed it in the specimen tray. The room was absolutely silent. Not the silence of peace. The silence of 18 people realizing they'd just watched something they didn't have a framework for understanding. Sterling was still standing by the wall, his hands at his sides, his face the color of old hospital sheets. "Brooks is stabilized," Margaret said, not to Sterling, not to anyone in particular, just stating facts the way you state the weather. "Get cardiothoracic down here. He needs imaging. He needs proper management from here forward." She turned to the resident. "Chen, stay with him. Monitor vitals every 5 minutes. Keep the 4 lines open. If anything changes, call me before you call anyone else." She pulled off the gloves with a snap, the same sound as putting them on, but in reverse, and the sound seemed to make Sterling flinch. Margaret turned toward the door and stopped, her eyes finding Sterling's. She didn't say anything. The silence was what was important. The silence was what told him that she knew exactly what he'd done, that she understood his negligence in precise and permanent detail, and that in the next few hours or days, he would understand that his mistake had been made in front of someone who recognized professional incompetence the way other people recognized their own names. The monitors screamed their electronic hysteria as Margaret moved through the corridor, her footfall steady and deliberate against linoleum that had witnessed 1,000 emergencies. Around her, staff scattered like startled birds, trauma surgeons abandoning their post-op rounds, orderlies ducking into supply closets, the chaos of human panic filling every hallway with the sound of dropped instruments and breathless shouts. But Margaret's breathing remained even. Her jaw stayed level. In Marjah, she'd moved through neighborhoods with IED tripwires strung at knee-height and hostile positions dug into compound walls, and panic was a bullet you fired at yourself. This was just a different kind of siege. Sterling had frozen at Brooks's bedside like a man watching his own incompetence materialize in real time, which was exactly what was happening. The attending physician's eyes darted between the monitor screens and his hands, searching for permission to move that his mind refused to grant. Fluid was flooding into the pericardial sac around Brooks's heart, the complication Sterling had missed, the cascade he'd triggered with his negligent post-operative assessment 3 hours earlier. Blood pressure dropping. Oxygen saturation at 71% and collapsing. The patient's consciousness flickering like a bulb about to fail. Margaret reached the resuscitation cart without breaking stride. Her hands moved with the certainty of someone who'd performed the same motions under far worse conditions, sand in her boots, incoming fire raking the perimeter, a Navy corpsman bleeding out next to her. The cardiac needle was 18 gauge, 3.5 inches, and she'd used 17 of them during her 12 years in the field. Her fingers located it by touch alone, the syringe already prepped, the angle already calibrated in the muscle memory that lived deeper than conscious thought. "Step back," she said to Sterling. Not a request. Not a question. The voice that emerged wasn't the deferential tone she'd been performing for 6 months, this was the voice that had commanded a 12-person direct action team in Kandahar. Sterling's legs actually moved without permission from his brain. Margaret positioned herself at Brooks's bedside, her left hand locating the fifth intercostal space at the mid-axillary line with the precision of someone who'd done field assessments on bleeding soldiers. The needle went in at a 45-degree angle, sliding past the parietal pericardium with the smallest yield of resistance, and then the thin hiss of air escaping as pressure released from inside the sac. That sound. Margaret had heard it before, every time it meant the difference between a body bag and a recovery. Blood flowed into the syringe. Dark, venous, telling the story of a compressed heart finally given room to beat. 40 ccs. 80 ccs. 120 ccs. The monitor's rhythm stabilized on the first beat. On the second beat, Brooks's oxygen saturation climbed, 75%, 82%, climbing with the steadiness of water finding its level. His blood pressure followed. Systolic rising from 68 to 89 to 104. The patient's eyes flickered open, conscious, terrified, but alive. "Thank you," Brooks whispered, his voice barely audible. "Thank you." Margaret withdrew the needle without responding, her attention still on the monitor, on the vital signs that were holding, on the proof that her hands hadn't forgotten what 15 years of combat medicine had taught them. Sinus rhythm. Regular. Steady. The kind of heartbeat that said second chances were possible. That was when Sterling's face cycled through the colors of his understanding. First white, the white of a man recognizing that his negligence had nearly killed a patient. Then red, the red of shame transforming into rage, because shame was weakness and weakness was intolerable for men like him. "That was beyond your scope," Sterling said. His voice came out strangled, as if his throat had tightened around the words. "You performed an invasive procedure without physician authorization. You contaminated a sterile field. But his voice broke because he couldn't finish the sentence that actually mattered, the sentence that lived in the silence. "You saved a life I was destroying through incompetence." Margaret didn't respond. She was already documenting the intervention on the chart, time of procedure, exact location, volume extracted, patient's response. The medical record was a weapon too, if you knew how to wield it. Everything she'd done was defensible because every centimeter had been clinically justified. The pericardiocentesis wasn't a question. It was a statement made in sterile technique and vital signs. But Sterling was already moving toward the exit, already pulling his phone from his pocket with shaking hands. Margaret watched him go without expression, which was her greatest tactical mistake. She'd expected anger. She hadn't expected strategy. Within 37 minutes, Sterling was on a conference call with 3 board members, his voice steady again, his narrative carefully constructed. A reckless nurse. A clear violation of scope of practice. A patient endangered by an unlicensed procedure. He'd contacted her nursing school references, asking pointed questions about her training, her judgment, her history of competence. By 43 minutes, he'd submitted formal incident reports to risk management with language so precise it felt like litigation preparation. By the hour mark, he'd personally called in an outside medical review team, 3 physicians from a competing hospital network, all colleagues from his medical school who owed him favors or feared his influence enough to listen carefully to his framing of the situation. By 2 o'clock, the hospital administrator, a man named Caldwell who played golf with Sterling every other Friday, had Margaret on administrative suspension pending investigation. By 2:45, she was being escorted from the building by security, her employee badge confiscated, her locker cleaned out with clinical efficiency. The badge went into a plastic bag. So did the 3 commendations she'd received for patient care, the thank you cards from families, the photograph of herself with the nursing staff from her first week, artifacts of an identity that had already begun to disappear. She drove home in silence, the Savannah afternoon pressed against her car windows like something alive and hostile. The sun was too bright. The traffic moved too slowly. Every red light felt like an accusation. Her 16-year-old son was at the kitchen table with his calculus textbook and the kind of exhausted focus that teenagers carry when they're trying to maintain decent grades without actually understanding why it matters. He looked up when she walked in, and his face shifted from concentration to confusion to alarm in the space of 3 seconds. "Mom? Why are you home? It's only 2:45. Margaret sat down across from him. She didn't say anything at first, just sat there with her hands flat on the table, watching them as if they belonged to someone else. Her son waited, the way he'd learned to wait when she got quiet, because her quiet had its own language. Sometimes, she began, and her voice wavered on the first word in a way it hadn't wavered all morning. Sometimes doing the right thing costs you everything. She told him she'd been suspended. She told him the investigation might last weeks or months. She couldn't tell him why she'd performed the procedure, that Brooks was his commanding officer, that she'd promised to keep an eye on him, that the obligation had come from a place deeper than civilian ethics. She couldn't tell him about the records, the erasure, the parts of her that belonged to a life that officially didn't exist anymore. The tears came then, rolling down her face without permission, and she wiped them away with the back of her hand like she was clearing away evidence. "Mom," her son said softly. "What happened?" "I saved a man's life," Margaret said. "And now they're going to destroy me for it." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then her phone rang. The hospital administrator's office smelled like old leather and bad decisions. Margaret sat in the chair across from his mahogany desk, her hands folded in her lap, her scrub still damp from the emergency that had just consumed 3 hours of her life. She already knew what was coming. She'd seen this play out 100 times in different contexts, the strategic removal of a threat. Not through combat. Through paperwork. "Dr. Sterling has filed a formal complaint," Administrator Hayes began, not meeting her eyes. He was already calculating liability, already thinking about his golf game with Sterling that weekend. "He alleges that you exceeded your scope of practice. That you performed a procedure without physician authorization. That you endangered a patient." The fluorescent panels above her head buzzed their mechanical song. Margaret didn't move. "We're placing you on immediate suspension, pending an independent medical review. I've already contacted an outside firm. They're sending 3 physicians to evaluate the clinical decision-making in room for 47. Hayes shuffled papers, a nervous gesture. "This isn't personal, Margaret. It's protocol." Protocol. The word hung in the air like smoke. Margaret had spent 15 years learning that protocol was the armor cowards wore when they wanted to destroy someone without getting blood on their hands. She stood. Steady. No tremor in her legs, no catch in her breath. Just the quiet movement of someone who understood that this moment was temporary. "I understand," she said. Her voice was still water. Flat. Controlled. "Security will escort you out. You'll turn in your badge and access card. You're not to contact any hospital staff regarding this matter. Is that clear?" She nodded once. The gesture of someone who'd already moved on to the next objective. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 6 hours later when she walked through her kitchen door and found her 16-year-old son, Jacob, sitting at the table with his calculus homework spread across the surface, his earbuds in, completely unaware that his mother's career had just been methodically dismantled by a man who couldn't handle being outmatched. He looked up, pulled his earbuds out. "Mom? You're home early. Are you sick?" She didn't answer. Couldn't answer. The professional composure that had held her together through the suspension, through the walk of shame past colleagues who wouldn't meet her eyes, through the security escort, it fractured. Not in a dramatic way. Not with anger or rage. But with the sudden, devastating understanding that she'd protected something sacred, something worth protecting, and it had cost her everything. She sat down across from him. And then the tears came. Jacob moved instantly, the way kids do when they realize something is genuinely wrong. "Mom? What happened? Are you fired?" "Not yet," she whispered. "But yes. Probably." Jacob's jaw tightened. At 16, he understood more than she'd ever wanted him to understand about the world's unfairness. "What did you do?" "I saved a man's life." She wiped her face with the back of her hand, a gesture so human, so UN military, that it broke something in her son's expression. His name is Lieutenant Commander Brooks. He works with you sometimes, I think. You mentioned him. Jacob's eyes widened. I did something I wasn't technically authorized to do. I performed a procedure your father taught me how to do when I was in the service. And it worked. Brooks is alive because of it. But my supervisor, a surgeon named Dr. Sterling, he can't accept that he missed the diagnosis. Can't accept that he froze while a nurse saved his patient. She looked at her son, really looked at him, and the weight of what she was about to say seemed to double. Sometimes, Jacob, doing the right thing costs everything. And you have to be willing to pay that cost anyway. Jacob reached across the table and took her hand. He didn't speak. Didn't offer platitudes. Just held her hand while she held herself together, one shattered breath at a time. 3 days later, Margaret sat in the hospital administrator's conference room for her termination hearing. Hayes was there. The outside review panel, 3 physicians she'd never met, men who'd been paid by Sterling to validate his narrative. Sterling himself, sitting with a lawyer, his face already showing the strain of controlled confidence. Margaret's own representation was a staff attorney from the hospital's HR department, someone with zero incentive to fight. The door opened. Jacob walked in. He was carrying a show box. Margaret's stomach dropped. She tried to signal him to stop, but her son had already crossed the room, had already positioned himself beside his mother's chair. His hands were steady. His voice, when he spoke, was loud enough to fill the conference room and echo down the hospital corridor outside. Mom, they need to see these. He opened the box. The room went so quiet you could hear the air conditioning cycling through the vents. Inside, lying on aged felt, were the insignia of a senior chief petty officer. 3 Purple Hearts. A Navy Cross. And a folded citation, yellowed with age, stamped with a seal that made Hayes's face go white. Jacob's voice cracked as he read aloud, Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, United States Navy Special Warfare, is hereby commended for extraordinary valor in combat operations, Helmand Province, August 2009 through June 2010. For actions during Operation Enduring Freedom in Marjah. For leadership above and beyond the call of duty. For direct actions that resulted in the extraction and rescue of captured American personnel. For service to this nation that exemplifies the highest standards of courage and honor. Sterling was already moving. Trying to slip out, trying to dissolve into the hallway, but his escape was interrupted by a man who stepped into the doorway. He was wearing a dark suit. He was FBI. His badge hung at chest level like a declaration. Agent Dawson, FBI Counterintelligence, he said, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. Senior Chief Walsh's personnel records were sealed 15 years ago following a classified hostage extraction operation that resulted in the rescue of 17 American military personnel from a black site detention facility in Kandahar. That operation was never officially acknowledged. That operation was never supposed to be discussed. The fact that we're here right now means someone has a lot of explaining to do. He turned directly to Hayes. Any attempt to punish or retaliate against Senior Chief Walsh for actions performed in a medical emergency would constitute federal retaliation against a protected veteran. The United States government would have significant objections to that arrangement. Brooks was in the room then, too, and Margaret hadn't even noticed him arrive. He was standing, his hand moving to the file, his voice still carrying the strength of a man who'd spent his adult life giving orders in combat zones. Senior Chief performed a textbook pericardiocentesis. I would be dead if she'd followed Dr. Sterling's orders to wait for cardiothoracic. She didn't hesitate. She didn't freeze. She performed emergency medicine under pressure with precision. That's not protocol violation. That's textbook trauma response. The hospital room door swung inward again. This time Rodriguez came through, Miguel Rodriguez, the hospital's IT director, a former Marine Corps signals intelligence specialist who'd been watching everything from behind his servers. He had a laptop and a flash drive and the kind of calm expression that comes from holding all the cards. I've been documenting Dr. Sterling's behavior since his harassment of Senior Chief Walsh began, Rodriguez said quietly. 6 months of security footage. 342 hours of it. He plugged the flash drive into the laptop and turned the screen toward the room. The video was crystal clear. Sterling in the cafeteria, deliberately bumping Margaret's tray, sending her lunch scattering across the floor like scattered ammunition. Sterling throwing the patient chart at her feet. Sterling's voice, recorded through the audio feed, "Pick that up, sweetheart. Some people just aren't cut out for real medicine." Then the footage shifted. The cardiac emergency. Sterling's face, slack with panic. Then Sterling leaving the room entirely when the code grey siren sounded, when danger arrived, when the moment required leadership. And Margaret, moving with the terrifying fluid precision of an apex predator toward the threat instead of away from it. Her hands steady as surgical lasers. Her voice calm as glacier water, "Nobody move. I have this." The final piece of footage made Sterling's lawyer actually stand up. Security footage from 2 nights ago. Sterling in the server room at 2:36 a.m. His hands on the keyboard. His face concentrated. Attempting to delete files. Attempting to erase evidence. Not realizing that Rodriguez had personal oversight of the backup system, that everything Sterling tried to destroy was being automatically preserved in an off-site location the hospital didn't even know about. "I've already forwarded everything to the state medical board," Rodriguez said. His voice had the quiet weight of someone delivering a sentence. Along with documentation that Dr. Sterling attempted to tamper with evidence after the fact. Sterling's lawyer was already gathering papers. The outside review panel suddenly had urgent other commitments. One of them actually pulled out his phone and started texting, already distancing himself from whatever was about to happen. Sterling tried to argue, tried to deflect, his voice rising in pitch with each word, but it was like watching someone try to argue with the tide. The administrator was white as drywall, already calculating liability, already making phone calls to the hospital's legal team. "This meeting is concluded," Agent Dawson said. His voice made the fluorescent lights seem to dim. "Senior Chief Walsh, you're cleared to return to full duty. Dr. Sterling, you're placed on immediate suspension pending investigation by both the state medical board and the federal government. You have the right to legal counsel." Sterling tried to leave. His legs carried him toward the door with the jerky movements of someone who'd forgotten how his body worked. Haste didn't stop him. Nobody stopped him. He just walked out into the hospital corridor and disappeared into the fluorescent-lit labyrinth of hallways and patient rooms and the weight of his own destruction. Margaret didn't watch him go. She was looking at her son. And her son was looking at her with an expression that said everything had changed between them in the space of 5 minutes. He finally understood. Finally saw. Finally knew who his mother really was. 6 months later, Margaret Walsh stood in front of a classroom full of surgical residents at Mercy General, teaching a trauma case from that Tuesday morning when everything had shifted. The hospital had made her the senior trauma specialist with explicit authorization to perform emergency procedures. The formal apology had come with a settlement check that she donated immediately to a veteran mental health organization serving people like Marcus Cole, the man she'd talked down in the ER. The settlement letter was already framed in the hospital's lobby. History. Evidence. Accountability. On her desk, no longer hidden in her locker, sat the pair of worn combat boots from Marjah. The leather was creased with memory. The laces were still caked with dust from a place most people couldn't find on a map. But they were displayed openly now, displayed proudly, a reminder that some battles are worth fighting twice. That the quiet person in the corner might just be the one holding everything together. That not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. Her son visited her office sometimes after school, proud to finally understand who his mother really was. Lieutenant Commander Brooks had written a commendation that went into her permanent personnel file. And Dr. Sterling was last seen selling supplemental insurance policies from a folding table outside a strip mall on the edge of Savannah, his expensive shoes scuffed, his network dissolved, his reputation evaporated like morning mist over the marshlands. On her last day of training those new residents, Margaret told them something she'd learned the hard way: competence is quiet. Courage is calm. And crisis reveals who people really are. One of the residents, a young woman who reminded Margaret of herself 15 years ago, asked quietly, "Chief Walsh, weren't you afraid?" Margaret thought about that question. Thought about what fear really means. "Fear is just information," she said. "And I process information fast." As evening fell over Savannah, Margaret walked past the ER entrance where she'd faced down danger while others ran. A young resident called after her, "Chief Walsh, thank you." She touched the combat boots on her desk one more time and smiled. Because finally, after all these years, someone had said what needed saying. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next one. Leave a comment below. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? I'd love to hear your story. And please share this video with someone who needs to know that quiet strength is still strength.